Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast. Ozcast. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
A room without books is like a body without a soul.
Hello, welcome to Sundoku, the podcast for book addicts just like ourselves, really. I'm Annie Hastwell.
And I'm Michaela Andreev. Now, it's drawing closer to Christmas, so it really is lovely that you found the time to have a listen to Sundoku. We do appreciate it. Annie, it's a busy week. What have you been up to this week?
Well, I've been looking into classics, recent classics as we like to. Philip Roth, he created an absolute storm back in the late 60s, early 70s with a book called Portnoy's Complaint. Lewd and disgusting, I think was how it was panned at the time, so everybody read it. And he also wrote a lot of other things. Brilliant Jewish writer from America. And if you haven't read him, we're going to, my friend Annie Warburton and I, who's a big fan of reading of all kinds and of his, are going to have a chat through some of his books and I guess also try and argue why they're still worth reading.
Well, that's it, isn't it? That's what makes it a classic. It has to still be worth reading. So can you give us a little sneaky reason why?
The one I read, which I'll talk about later on, is called The Plot Against America. And the reason I read it was because of the rise of Trump. And my mother, who's was a great reader, suggested that that was a really good book to read to understand sort of the rise of a demagogue, really, or a populist president. So I did read it, and my goodness, I was so amazed at how good the writing was. Like, I think I'd forgotten how dense and good writing of that era can be. Like,
what era are we talking?
Well, it's set back in World War II, and it's like his reimagining of how things could have gone in America. And, you know, he goes quite close to the truth, and it's also his own upbringing, but totally absorbing.
And prescient by the sounds of it.
And Annie will talk about a lot of his other books, including that shocker, Portnoy's Complaint, which I don't think I ever read, but certainly...
Well, I hope one of you's read it, at least, if you're going to talk about it.
She has, yes. But, Michaela, we're drawing close to that time of year when it's like, what book do I take on holiday? I do love a dystopia, and I think what you've been reading and the author that we're about to hear, it's a dystopia. Am I right?
It is. It's called Every Version of You. It's by Grace Chan. I caught up with her when she was in Adelaide for the AusAsia Festival. And she calls it speculative fiction, which is the new term to me that you introduced me to with Cole Haddon's Psalms for the End of the World. So I guess it's like science fiction meets dystopian, but I think in speculative fiction you're creating another world, and that's just what she's done. So in Every Version of You, we follow the lives of Dao Yi and Naveen, and they're spending much of their lives in sort of a richly immersive virtual reality. It's a world called Gaia that's digital. And they enter Gaia every day by going into these sort of pods of gel that then keep them fed and watered and so forth. But the technology is moving on, and they have the opportunity to permanently upload their consciousness to Gaia and leave their bodies behind. So, as you can imagine, all sorts of ethical and emotional implications for all this. So, I was actually still reading the book as I approached the interview. So I was driving along, and I was still immersed in this world of Gaia. It really captured my imagination. And I'm not a big reader of this type of fiction usually, but I wasn't able to fully let it go. So I asked Grace, what's she like when she's writing about this world?
To be honest, I think I'm always a bit like that. So I kind of live halfway in reality and halfway in my own head a lot of the time, which I think is a nice state to be in. So between the day job and writing, in the evenings I'll often try to set aside a couple of hours here and there, not every day. I'm not a writer who can write every day, but not even just to write, but sometimes just to set aside time to delve into a different world, to world build, to imagine what the world would be like, 50, 100 years into the future.
With every book, there's what happens and then there's what it is you want to say. So could we start with what happens in Every Version of You?
Yeah, so Every Version of You, as you know, is my debut novel. It's a science fiction novel, and it's set in late 21st century Australia, and also a very immersive, clean, shiny virtual reality world called Gaia. It's about a 20-something Malaysian Chinese Australian woman called Tao Yi, and her partner, who's from San Francisco but moves to Australia, and his name is Naveen. And it's about what happens when the technology around virtual reality and minds accelerates very rapidly. And this forces Tao Yi to consider what it is that's most important to her. The pull of, her relationship with Naveen, her relationship to her mother, her own past, her connection to the physical world, her friends, the choices that she makes. So that's every version of you.
Yeah, great. And what is it that you wanted to say with this book? Because it is a book that makes you think from the very beginning. What are the things that you wanted people to think about as they read?
To be completely honest, I didn't have an answer to that question when I started writing it. Yes. I mean, when the idea first came to me, it was the central conflict, which is around virtual reality and the uploading of a mind, and how that creates tension in the relationship between Tao Yi and Naveen. And also, I guess, I was grappling with questions of like change and identity and how we sort of hold ourselves together when we change so much and the people we are in relationships with change so much throughout our lives. What are the narratives, the stories that we tell ourselves to hold things together? I think bits of it just came together as a kind of giant jigsaw puzzle as I grappled with how could I build a world where the two main characters, Tao Yi and Naveen, were grappling with this core conflict. And then, throwing virtual reality in there and parties in virtual space and, immersives and that kind of thing was a whole lot of fun.
Yeah. Oh, it is a lot of fun because the characters in the story go into, how do you pronounce them? Neopods?
New pods.
New pods,
yeah,
okay,
so,
new pods.
Yeah.
And they're immersed in a gel, and this gel feeds them, it takes their waste away, it gives them a sense of touch. It is thoroughly immersive, and it's great how you can picture this working.
That was fun to do as well because I was lucky enough that I could draw a bit on my medical knowledge and just be like, okay, I know a little bit about the brain and how nerves work, and I just wanted to really capture the visceral feeling of like lying in gel, bypassing the physical world, bypassing the way we normally interact with our environments.
Which creates this sort of other side to it where everyone has to be fully shaven. I presume eyebrows and everything has to go, doesn't it, in order to have that connection with skin?
Yeah. I mean, on a practical level, I was just problem solving. How would it actually work? And I thought to have that connection with the brain, you'd have to remove hair, I think, so that electrical impulses could travel through your scalp and into the brain. And then the magical new gel does a lot of other bodily functions for you. So you have the convenience of being in the virtual world for many, many hours. So
it takes the waste away.
Provides nutrition, hydration, stimulates your muscle cells to make sure they stay in shape and that kind of thing.
Yeah. So tell me, what's your medical background? How has this all helped with writing of the book?
Yeah, so I'm a doctor. I did a medical degree and worked for quite a number of years in the hospital system where I also completed my psychiatry training, something that comes across in my writing as well, my fascination with minds and brains and the stories that we tell ourselves.
Yeah, well, you've got the physical there with the medical practice, but you've also got the mental there with the psychiatry, because a lot of what's happening in this book is happening in people's minds. They're making decisions, they're making choices, they're looking at the ethical implications of the choices that they make, and they're looking at what will make them happy, what is a good life.
Yeah, and I guess a lot of the book does take place in virtual spaces, and I wanted to kind of question the idea that, what happens in virtual spaces is not as real as what happens in the physical world. I did want to kind of interrogate that a little bit because so much of our lives takes place online nowadays. And I think in a way, some of those experiences can be hyper real or just as powerful in terms of the way we feel about ourselves, the way we explore different parts of our identities online, and the way we relate to other people. I think that, being online shapes us and shapes the way we relate to people around us and shape society as well.
Yeah, and you've created a world in 2080. So it's not that far away. Like, I'll be gone, presumably, by then. But my children would be 79 and 80 in this world. So you're creating a world where there has been a lot of rapid change, but we're still the same, I feel. I feel that comes through in your work, that we're still grappling with the same choices and we're still living in a very similar society. There's a capitalist society. The rich and the poor are still very much divided. So the poor can't get online.
Access to it.
Yeah, they can't live in these new pods. They're living out in a really degraded environment, a scary, polluted, harsh environment. So some things are changing very rapidly, the technology is, but some things are staying very much the same.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
Oh, I have so many thoughts about that.
hit me up with two of them.
Okay.
Or more.
I guess one reason why you get that sense from the novel maybe is because I feel like technology has changed so much in the last few decades, and I have a lot of nostalgia for the way that technology has rapidly changed, especially during my childhood and adolescent years. And I've really got to feel the way that has impacted on how I formed my identity, being a teenager and being the internet was just kind of taking off in the 90s and the 2000s, and being able to interact with your friends in different ways every year, it kind of changed.
Yeah.
I guess the other thing was I eventually decided to set the novel not too far in the future. It's just 2 generations really into the future.
Yeah.
So Tao Yi's mother, Xin Yi, was born in the 2020s, so she'd be the generation being born now. And I guess it felt kind of right to set it closer to the present day, because really I don't think I'm writing about the future. I'm making stuff up and trying to make it sound plausible. But I think a lot of the anxieties and the feelings about technology in the novel are from the present day.
You say you're nostalgic about your youth and the introduction of technology. Where do you sit in this big question which is raised in your book? So Naveen has health concerns. He's deciding whether to upload his consciousness to the online world, Gaia. He's pretty keen because he's not well. Whereas Dao Yi, she's maybe a bit like you. She's a little bit nostalgic for the past and wonders if this is a good idea. So what are your thoughts about technology versus just plain good old living?
It is the inevitable question from the book. But to be honest, I am a bit like Tao Yi in that I'm ambivalent. I think that technology is changing so rapidly, and it's going to have ongoing powerful influence on our identities and our relationships and how we relate to one another. But I also think technology is very exciting. I think it has the potential to connect us to new and exciting communities, expose us to new ideas that we might not have access to in our...
Well, that's, I guess, what it is as a writer. You're capable of exploring all of these points of view, and that's what you've done with the book.
To put it, to put my ambivalence and my uncertainty about the whole thing. It's probably, the book is a reflection, I think, maybe of my my different feelings about technology, and it was a bit of a thought experiment for me to think about what do we give up when we go into online spaces, and how do they change us?
And it's not just sci-fi or speculative fiction. It's also a new genre that I've been introduced to, which is cli-fi, climate fiction, I think. The planet is in a very bad way in 2080 that you describe. There's a beautiful scene when Dao Yi is in a street of Melbourne, and she catches a sight of a possum, and I think it's the only sighting of an animal in the book. And I did think, where is that animal living and how's it surviving? And it was very sad. What are your thoughts on where we're headed from in a climate sense?
Yeah. I think the book was inevitably cli-fi, partly because as I was world building, I had to think about what could be a plausible reason for people to relinquish the physical world for the virtual world. And in a very spent, climate ravaged, late 21st century, the virtual world of Gaia is easy. So in a way, it's an escape for people. From a personal point of view, I do feel quite sad about the ecosystems that are being lost around the world and the change in our environments that we're seeing today. And I do feel that it can be quite easy to feel very pessimistic about the lack of action that's being taken about our environment today.
Yeah. And that's a very considered answer. So you had to give people a reason to relinquish their bodies, and that is the climate, which I would say it's a considered book. It's so thorough. I love that about it. And I also love the vibe, which, to quote the castle, it's a calm book. It's a quiet book. The relationship between Dao Yi and Naveen is beautiful. It's just calm. It's just right. And they understand each other and they're going in different directions, which gives it its poignancy because there's no ill will. There's just a really big choice that people now have to make in their world. But there is that sense of doom in the book, and I guess that's necessary, as you're saying.
Yeah, I'm glad you put it so nicely, because as I was drafting and redrafting this book, I was thinking, it's not an action-packed book. It's a sort of...
I guess, yeah. I guess in a way it's not, but see, I'm someone that really, I can't watch the news anymore. I just need the good news,
Yeah, I can identify.
That's where I'm at. And I appreciate your imagination as well. I mean, I like the fact that you've obviously given a lot of thought to the language. So it's just peppered with enough foreign words that you haven't heard, these sort of inventions that you haven't heard before. I mean, I've just got a few written down here. So there's the maglev, the train system. There's Teresa, the medical system. There's Mercury. I want Mercury. Mercury carries your goods home. So say you go to IKEA and you buy a giant couch. First it gets spatially compressed, and then this little machine called a Mercury just sort of flies along beside you and
ports it home for you.
Ports it, that's it. And it sits in a corner of the bus with you. And then it comes back to your house and it expands, and these are wonderful. So you didn't have to in any place in the book explain what these things were. They just were, and I like that as well. It wasn't so different that you had to constantly be telling me things.
Of course. I mean, I'm a huge fan of science fiction and speculative fiction in general, so I had a whole heap of fun building little elements of both the physical world in 2 generations from now, and how the virtual world might take shape and how it might look, and all the little logistics of how you might log in and that kind of thing. So I'm glad you enjoyed some of those little details.
Oh, absolutely, I did. Is there a significance to the names of Dao Yi and her mum Xin Yi as well? And Naveen?
That's a lovely question. I think that's the first time I've been asked that. And yes, there actually is some slight significance. I mean, I just like to play a little bit with their names. Tao Yi, I wanted her to have a Chinese name. And I think Tao invokes a little bit of the Tao Te Ching, or, oh my gosh, my pronunciation. But the way, so thinking about the way, I just wanted it to have a little bit of that association. But also for her to not know exactly which characters her name came from, to also have a bit of a loss of meaning in her own name. And that search for meaning within her own name comes up a little bit in the book as well. Naveen, his name is a little bit of a play on ships.
I didn't pick that up. Please explain.
It's probably just a little personal play on ships, because in the very early draft of this novel, it was called It had a rather pretentious title. It was called The Ship of Theseus. So the novel drew on the Ship of Theseus paradox, or the Ship of Theseus thought experiment, which is that thought experiment where if a ship has all its parts gradually replaced year after year until at some point all of its parts have been replaced, can it still be considered the same ship or the original ship?
Yeah.
So
and also just with life, all of our cells are constantly changing. So are we the same person? Which then gets to the central theme of your book, which is
what if you suddenly,
if we let the ship go and we just leave the navigation equipment in place and take off in a new gel pod?
Yes.
Are we still the same person?
Are we still the same person if there's something that completely transforms us very suddenly?
Yeah. And just before we finish, I love to ask people, what is on your sundoku? What have you got that you've been reading or that you would like to be reading soon?
I'm not sure you want to go there, Michaela. My sundoku is very chaotic.
That's part of the definition, I think. That's okay.
I'm someone who's in the middle of between 5 to 10 things at one time.
Oh, go
it's a bit chaotic.
That's great.
No, there's no sense to it. So let me think. I mean, recently I did finish Empathy by Hua Pham, and also Everything Feels Like the End of the World, which is a speculative short story collection by Else Fitzgerald, another debut Australian author. I brought along a book to Adelaide because I couldn't, of course, can't travel without one. I'm reading Terminal Boredom, which is a Izumi Suzuki. It's a wacky collection of, again, speculative fiction short stories. She was a Japanese speculative fiction writer, and I am also in the middle of I'm Waiting for You by Kim Bo-young, who is a Korean speculative fiction writer, and a lovely collection of Southeast Asian speculative fiction short stories called Where the Stars Rise. I hope I got that right. That's been on my to-read list for a while, so I'm making my way through that. So yeah, speculative fiction is definitely flavour.
I'm seeing a theme here. Have you ever read a non-fiction? Oh, hang on, you're a doctor. You've read plenty of non-fiction. You've had a gut full of non-fiction, haven't you?
I do try. I try to read speculative fiction, but also non-fiction and literary fiction as well. Mm-hmm. But speculative fiction's, of course, a huge love of mine, and I think having just released my debut novel, I've gone, okay, now I can get back into some reading and just kind of trying to gobble up as much as I can.
Not being a big reader of speculative fiction, everything on Grace's Sundoku list was a mystery to me and something new, so hopefully there's some tips there for people who are wanting to explore this genre a little further.
In our classic segment today, we're talking about Philip Roth, one of the towering figures of 20th century American letters and one of the most awarded writers of his generation. Now, I recently read The Plot Against America, and it's a kind of alternate but credible reality of the US in World War II, with Charles Lindbergh becoming a populist president who sympathises with the Nazis. My fellow book lover Annie Warburton's been going through a bit of a Philip Roth phase.
Yes, I have, Annie. Yes, I found 2 film versions of his novels on streamers. The Human Stain came up. I think that's a Philip Roth story. I'll watch that. I watched it. And then I found another one shortly thereafterwards, American Pastoral. So I watched them both. And of course, then I had to read the novels. My Life as a Man, which is a kind of a portrait of his unhappy first marriage. The Breast, which is a kind of Kafka-esque story, except where the protagonist doesn't turn into a beetle unexpectedly, but into a human breast. And it's about sex and masculinity. And also, I read Nemesis, I had found on my own shelves, which is Roth's last book. And that one is about, well, it goes right back to his childhood birthplace, Weequahic, New Jersey, where Portnoy's Complaint is also set. But his last book, is also set there, and that deals with the polio epidemic of the 1940s, and it's a little bit prescient too of the COVID epidemic.
He certainly was a towering intellect with an intense interest in what was going on around him in the world as well as sex. But let's talk about the most notorious one, Portnoy's complaint, which I remember as being the very byword for moral outrage.
Yes, yeah, Portnoy's complaint. It takes the form of a long, uninhibited confession in intimate, shameful detail by a young man at this stage, Alexander Portnoy, looking back from his teenage years. He's pouring this all out to his psychotherapist, all his frustrations and longings and anxieties from his horny teenage schoolboy masturbator years to being mother-conflicted, horny young professional man, still in the grip of sexual angst. Everyone was reading it when I started uni in 1970. Even and especially perhaps boys who found its graphic depictions of masturbation hilarious.
No
Indeed,
wonder.
Well, it was supposed that Portnoy's complaint, this was a common misunderstanding, I think, was addiction to masturbation, but it's not. In fact, Roth defines it as Portnoy's complaint, a disorder in which strongly felt ethical and altruistic impulses are perpetually warring with extreme sexual longings, often of a perverse nature.
It caused such a storm at the time, and there were a few other risque books around as well. Why was that?
Yeah, well, the publication of the novel, it was 1969, caused a major controversy in American public life. A, for the detailed depictions of masturbation, which was revolutionary in the late 1960s, and the irreverent portrait of Jewish identity. It sparked an uproar in the Jewish community, even among New York intellectuals.
Were they upset by how they were being portrayed?
Yes, he was accused of being a self-hating Jew, and they didn't like the general decadence and degradation in later parts of the book. Some of his sexual behaviour is fairly rank, I guess you could say. In Australia, it was declared a prohibited import, but Penguin, which is the Australian publisher, got around the ban by having copies printed in Sydney in secret and stored in fleets of moving trucks to avoid seizure under state obscenity laws.
So there was a black market in Portnoy's complaint in Australia.
Yes. There were successful prosecutions in Victoria and Queensland, but they failed in Western Australia on the grounds of the book's literary merit. In New South Wales, 2 trials resulted in hung juries. South Australia, there you go, good old liberal, progressive South Australia bucked the system, declaring it wouldn't prosecute sales of the work made to an adult who made a direct inquiry of the vendor, provided the books were kept behind the counter. Mind you, rereading it, I was struck again by how graphic it is and how completely candid and confessional. I don't think there'd been anything quite like it to date. I mean, we can remember the furor around Lady Chatterley's lover some years earlier, but there was something sort of poetic about Lawrence's couple, wasn't there?
It was a bit more elegant, I think. There was sex,
That's
obviously,
right.
but this sounds like it would have really offended moral decency, I can imagine. Did it offend your moral decency rereading it?
Oh, no. I relished its candor. There's also, the larger question of his relationship with women, and his Jewishness is a constant theme. So look, The Plot Against America is a much later book than Portnoy's complaint. I haven't read it. What did you get from that, Annie?
This book he wrote in 2004, and I'm really not sure why he was inspired to write it then, because it's clearly a memoir of him as a small boy during World War II, and really fascinating because I imagine, as things hotted up in Europe and as Hitler rose to power and anti-Semitism became clearly more and more obvious, a small, very smart boy like Philip Roth growing up in America would have feared terribly at that age. His parents were Jewish. There would have been a certain amount of anti-Semitism in the air in America, and he kind of confabulated, as kids do, really, a fantasy in which things got really, really, really bad in America. It's like an alternate reality. Charles Lindbergh, who's a total hero, also a rabid isolationist, because remember, America didn't enter the war for a while. It becomes president, read Trump, popular president, and then he negotiated an understanding with Adolf Hitler, and they started this kind of folksy anti-Semitism where they were trying to get Jewish people to mix with other people. So, for example, Philip Roth's brother gets taken off to work on a farm for a Gentile, and it's full of the glory of being out in the fresh air and hard work and all that sort of thing, which kind of is a little bit like the glory of peasant work that Hitler talked about during the rise in the 30s. So there's all this, like, you don't want to be decadent in any way. So yeah, it's kind of like his boyhood fantasy where he turns what's around him into a really dramatic story and then works out a way through it. It's quite a wonderful book. I had just forgotten how good a writer can be, like how detailed and dense. American writers are very good at this, how they can build up a whole world. He uses his own family, his own parents, his own brother in the book. I don't know how they felt about that. At its heart, there's this feeling about American individualism giving way to the cult of celebrity. Well, we've seen that happen since, haven't we? But he could obviously feel that in the air maybe in 2004, which reminded him of his childhood. And there's also that thing about Americans love their democracy so much, but the danger that it can lead to a tyranny of the majority and gaining a grip on the three branches of government. It's really well spelled out in the book how that can happen, how democracy can lead to tyranny. And then, of course, it's almost like a movie. Things turn around at the end. I didn't think they were going to. You get towards the end of this book and you can't imagine how he's going to end it because we all know what really happened. But anyway, I would wholeheartedly recommend this book. It's, a small, clever, scared boy's fantasies in reaction to what was happening in Europe. And also a really detailed account of what life would have been like for a working-class Jewish family at that time. As I say, I don't know why he wrote it when he did. Maybe he could see where things were heading with the cult of celebrity, certainly. But by the time Donald Trump was looking like a real possibility in about 2016, this was truly a cautionary tale of where things could go.
Yeah, there's a kind of prescience in a lot of Philip Roth's work. There's that you've just outlined, and then also in the one that I mentioned, his last book, Nemesis, which is a kind of, turns out to be a fairly eerie foreseeing of how a community turns in on itself and becomes almost poisoned by fear of strangers. And he's using the polio epidemic of the 1940s to tell that story, of course. And it was worse than COVID because it attacked the young and healthy above all.
What has Roth got to offer a modern reader, a young modern reader, what do you think?
The Human Stain was one of the later books, and that features his recurring autobiographical character, Nathan Zuckerman, who's an observer of what happens to a friend and colleague who's a college professor. It's been said that he writes about traumatic moments in American history. The Human Stain, what happens to this college professor friend of his is that he uses the word, ignorantly, he uses the word spooks. He said, there's a couple of my students who are never in class. What are they? Spooks? And he means ghosts because he's an older man. He doesn't realise that the word has picked up racist or, intensely racial connotations, a bit like the N word, spooks. And of course, this causes a furor, destroys him. He leaves academia. He takes up with a young woman played by Nicole Kidman. Again, quite prescient in a way, foreseeing some of the cancel culture issues that have come up in recent years. The other one is American Pastoral. Swede Levov is a Jewish man. He's a successful businessman. He's blonde and he's a good athlete, so he doesn't look Jewish. So he sort of achieves the American dream. And he's got it all, he apparently has it all, until his daughter rejects it. And the daughter joins some outfit like the Weather Underground, some violent domestic terrorist outfit. And she actually is involved in a bombing which kills someone. And this destroys the family's life, really. So I don't know what Roth is saying there, whether there's some suggestion that, that it's some kind of payment to Lvov for trying to deny his Jewishness in a way. But it looks at the violent, divisive elements in American society. So those two books made into movies certainly tackled, big themes in American life.
A finger on the pulse, big themes. Philip Roth, still worth reading.
Oh, Heavens, yes. And not just because of the big themes, and because he's so funny. I've got to say, some of the descriptions of his mother, his suffocating, almost hysterical mother in Portnoy's Complaint, are just laugh out loud funny. They really are, the way he recreates her panic over, if he sort of picks up something from the street or touches a dog, or she catastrophizes everything, and really, really worth reading for a laugh as well.
Tasmanian former broadcaster and avid reader Annie Warburton. We were talking about the works of American author Philip Roth.
You're listening to Sundoku, the podcast for addicted readers.
My name's Mads. I started to love reading after my dad got me a Ramona Quimby book. I got into a lot of John Marsden after reading Tomorrow When the War Began, so I feel like that was quite a pivotal book. And I remember sitting in the back of my parents' car, driving through the Adelaide Hills. We'd come up for a milkshake at the Allgate General Store, wanting to read this book so much that I even got car sick from the milkshake, but I just had to keep reading, ploughing through. And at that point I realised how important books are to take you to a different place. In Year 10 English, we got into a lot of Jane Austen. My teacher introduced us to the BBC series, and then I discovered the books. I reread them. Oh, the characters. The strong female lead runs through all of the books I love. They still love and they still give, and family's still important and community's still important, but they know their own mind. They know what they want and they go about it in a way which I guess really resonates with me. I actually got Maggie Dent's new book about raising girls because I have an 8-year-old and a 6-year-old girl and a 6-year-old boy. I'm just, I guess, always learning. I have Seeing Other People by Diana Reid, which I haven't read, but her other book, Love and Virtue. The story she tells and the characters, you're just taken away with her. I just finished The Paper Palace by Miranda Cowley Heller, set in upstate New York. When she's a child, they go to this kind of like a holiday town and they have like a little shack. It's very much a shack, hence the Paper Palace. And she has experiences there as a child, as a teenager, as a young adult, and then she takes her own children back. So it's kind of like this sequential story that starts at the end and then it is made sense of throughout the whole book. And it's lovely, it sort of wraps up quite nicely. I just also finished A Room Made of Leaves by Kate Grenville. It's based on a memoir of the wife of John MacArthur. Fascinating, and it's kind of like what was her perspective of what it was like to live in Australia. Those very early days as a woman who's sort of been plucked from the countryside of England. That one has stayed with me quite a bit.
That's it for Sundoku today. Next week, we've got a bit of a treat. Christmas coming, holidays coming. We're going to cram all 4 of us into this tiny little studio and talk about what you might want to be reading over the holidays, as well as talking to an author of a thoroughly good read. I'm Annie Hastwell. Thanks for your company today.
And I'm Michaela Andreev. Keep reading.
This podcast is produced by 4 book addicts refusing treatment.
Kath Keneally,
Michaela Andreev,
Annie Hastwell,
And me, Sarah Martin. Our thanks to composer Quincy Grant for the music. If you want to know more about the books and authors featured in this episode, check out the show notes. And you can find us on Facebook and Instagram at SundokuCast, TSUNDOKU cast.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.